intense feeling of panic that threatened to overwhelm his grip on sanity. An elapsed time of 2 hours meant he must have gone off the trail that he and his team had carefully, clandestinely marked at least, an hour ago. If not more, he calculated, wincing in dismay as he realized how far off track he might be at this very moment. A sense of numbness began to flood his mind. No, wait. Can't let yourself panic. Stop. And think. He forced himself to remain calm as he made a slow 360-degree turn in place, searching desperately as he did so for some sign of one of their partially concealed markers, some recognizable rock formation, or even an isolated clump of tall trees. But he saw nothing that looked even vaguely familiar. Nothing at all. It was only then that he lowered his gaze and saw the increasingly larger clumps of drifting snow tumbling, one after another, into the gaping holes of his long trail of deep boot tracks. Oh, shit. The sudden awareness that he might not be able to find his way back to his truck if he didn't turn back right now seized at his heart like a clawed fist. He turned around sharply, intent on sprinting back down the windy mountain trail that he'd worked so hard to climb, but then somehow managed to hold himself in check. No, wait, not yet. Give yourself one last chance. 5 more minutes and that's all. If you don't see something familiar by then, go back. After quickly double-checking his watch and then taking in a couple of semi-deep breaths through the coarse fabric of his scarf, he started off to his left on a right-angled vector from his intended path, scrambling up a steeper slope that he hoped would give him a better vantage point. 3 minutes later, after pulling himself forward and upward on his hands and knees, fighting all the while the weight of the backpack he wasn't about to leave behind, he finally reached the summit, stood up, and then dropped to his knees again as the ground beneath him shook and trembled violently. Earthquake! The rumbling continued for 3 more seconds, and then stopped as suddenly as it began. He stayed on his hands and knees for another 15 seconds, waiting for the aftershock, but when none came, he stood back up, took a few stumbling steps forward, and then blinked in disbelief. The scenery before his eyes, almost as far as he could see through the increasingly dense clumps of falling snowflakes, was a liquid surface still roiling from the cross-rippling effects of the brief tremor. He felt his knees sag. Oh, dear God. The lake. Or, to be more precise, the incredibly large and irregular lake that had no name and didn't even appear on any of his team's maps because, according to the series of satellite maps he'd gone to a great deal of effort and expense to obtain from one of his well-placed sources, it hadn't existed as much as a few days ago. His mind turning, he quickly worked his way back down the slope to his right-angled starting point and then began retracing his steps without actually being aware that he'd made his decision. 15 minutes later, he could feel the sweat beginning to soak into his silk long johns, a sure sign that he was laboring too hard, even though the trail was now mostly downhill and much easier to navigate than it had been coming up. But the sky seemed to be darkening by the minute. The falling snowflake clumps were turning into a blizzard, and his mind was being pummeled with the images of rapidly disappearing boot prints, so he forced himself to maintain his pace. 2 hours up means only an hour back, he reassured himself, as he paused to take a quick sip from one of his water bottles. And maybe less if... At that moment, the sound of a tree branch snapping loudly from somewhere back in the direction he had come echoed across the chilled night air, causing the uneasy voice in the back of his head to suddenly shriek in fright. He'd been running for at least 15 seconds, wide-eyed and barely aware that he was doing so, when he managed to make the incredibly stupid mistake of not paying attention to where he was going. The brittle tree limb was lying perpendicular to the long axis of his boot trail, positioned almost exactly equidistant between 2 of the rapidly filling boot prints and buried beneath 8 inches of fresh snow. All it needed was a moment of carelessness, a misplaced boot, lunging downward, then... snap! A sharp pain ripped through his ankle,